Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my lecture on oxygen and carbon dioxide transport in the respiratory system. Okay, so we have two major topics to cover today, gas diffusion and gas transport. This seems like an awful lot of learning objectives, and I'm not sure that we're going to meet all of them, but we're essentially going to talk about gas movements between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, and then between systemic capillaries and body tissues. And we're going to talk about the ways in which oxygen is transported in the blood and the ways that carbon dioxide is transported as carbonic acid. Okay, so if you're following along with my last presentation, this is basically phases 2 through 4 of my 5 phases of respiration: external respiration, gas transport, and then internal respiration. Okay. In the external respiration, blood enters the lungs at 40 millimeters of mercury oxygen, 45 millimeters of mercury CO2. You may wonder why we're talking about millimeters of mercury, which are usually a pressure unit. These are what we call equivalent partial pressures. So the air in the alveoli, I can't talk today. The air in the alveoli, alveoli, has got an actual pressure of 104 millimeters of oxygen and 40 millimeters of CO2. Those are called partial pressures because the total pressure in the alveoli is about 760 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen is 20% of that. CO2 is less than 20% of that, obviously. They make up a partial portion of the air in your lungs, so they get a partial portion of the pressure there. Now, oxygen dissolved in blood does not actually have a pressure, but this is the equivalent vapor pressure, the equivalent pressure that gas would exert if it were in the gaseous state. Okay, so 40 millimeters equivalent of oxygen are dissolved in the blood, 45 millimeters equivalent are dissolved of CO2 are dissolved in the blood. So let's take a look at how that works out. So we know that the blood coming in has more CO2 than oxygen, so we have come to recognize that as blue blood. Okay, and sure enough, it has 40 millimeters of oxygen, about as low as oxygen gets in the blood, and 45 millimeters of CO2, about as high as CO2 gets in the blood. Well, as we travel through the pulmonary capillary here, that changes. There's a driving force. If we compare oxygen in the air and oxygen in the blood, we have air is at 104, blood is down at 40. That means we have what we call a concentration gradient, okay, or a partial pressure gradient in this case. Okay. Diffusion always happens down a gradient, so oxygen is going to travel from the air into the blood, as this red arrow here indicates. How long is it going to travel into the blood? Until the blood, as oxygen travels into the blood, the blood concentration of oxygen rises until it equals that 104. And so coming out, the blood exiting the lungs is what we have come to know as red blood, which is higher in oxygen and lower in CO2. So at the same time, the exact same thing is happening with CO2, but in the opposite direction. CO2 comes in at 45 millimeters in the blood and 40 millimeters in the air. So our concentration gradient is down, for, the downward direction is from blood to air. So CO2 is going to travel downward, down the concentration gradient from the blood into the air, as that blue arrow suggests. How far down is it going to go? Well, as CO2 leaves the blood concentration of CO2 falls until it reaches an equilibrium with the air in the lungs, and so the air leaving the lungs, the blood leaving the lungs, the CO2 has fallen down to 40. Okay. Now, how do these gases get around? Well, first off, we just need to understand that 40 millimeters of oxygen or 100 millimeters of oxygen, either way, is not actually a very large amount of oxygen in the blood. It takes the solubility of oxygen in water, which is mostly what plasma is very, very low. Okay. And so that's why you have to have those little bubbling machines in an aquarium. If you have a fish tank, you have to keep bubbling air through it because the amount of oxygen that actually dissolves in the water is very, very low. So we need another way to carry oxygen. And the way that our body has developed is hemoglobin. If you remember from our unit on blood, there are 2 alpha and 2 beta protein chains that come together to make one hemoglobin molecule. And at the heart of each of those is an iron atom not Fe, an iron atom encased in a little clover leaf of heme. Okay, and it is there that 4 molecules of oxygen can bind and get carried throughout the body. But how well that oxygen sticks to that iron depends on the conformation of the hemoglobin protein. And hemoglobin, like all proteins, its shape, its conformation, is affected by conditions in the fluid that it's in. Okay, so if there's a high oxygen concentration, that shifts the conformation of hemoglobin one way. If there's a low oxygen concentration, it shifts it a different way. Same for CO2, and the accompanying pH change will shift it one way or another. Temperature will shift it one way or another. We're going to look specifically today at the effect of oxygen on hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Okay, so as oxygen increases on this axis on the bottom here, as PO2 increases, hemoglobin shifts from a lower affinity form to a higher affinity form. Okay, in most cases, binding is sort of either linear, you'd expect to see it go like that, or it's perfectly bimodal, that you have a rapid loading in the middle of the curve and then it saturates. Neither of those describes hemoglobin. What hemoglobin does is it picks up a lot of oxygen very quickly, and then it saturates at all the physiological oxygen concentrations here. So in the lungs, our PO2 is around 100, and so our loading of hemoglobin is near 100%, which is what you want in the lungs. You want hemoglobin to load up completely with oxygen, to pick up as much oxygen from the lungs as it can. In a typical tissue, okay, tissue that is going through a typical amount of metabolism, the PO2 is down around 40. And as you can see here, that gives an unloading of about 75%, or a loading of about 75%. So we're actually, of the 4 oxygens that hemoglobin is carrying around with it, we're only letting one of them off as we pass through a typical tissue. Now, if you get to a tissue that's really hypoxic, maybe a muscle that's working out beyond its normal capacity, or the heart muscle when it's pumping at 150 beats per minute or something like that, then PO2 can be driven down further. And if we look at, say, the realm of 20 millimeters of mercury oxygen, there we have about 35% loading. So we've unloaded another, on average, 1.5 molecules of oxygen in that tissue. So hemoglobin is engineered, okay, it's not engineered, it's evolved, but hemoglobin is evolved to let go of a small amount of oxygen in tissues that need a small amount, and a larger amount of oxygen in tissues that need a larger amount. Okay, and that 75% saturation that happens in your typical tissue is known as the oxygen reserve. Okay. Carbon dioxide does not typically travel in large amounts attached to hemoglobin. There is a reaction where carbon dioxide attaches to hemoglobin, and a small amount of carbon dioxide, maybe about 10% of your carrying capacity, is carried that way. But most of the carbonic acid that travels in your blood works this way. CO2 combines with our good old friend H2O, who is obviously around in plenty, to form H2CO3, known as carbonic acid. And then that uncombines. Okay, carbonic acid looks like this. Okay, and one of these H's is pretty loosely held. Okay, so it can break off and form that instead. So that gives us an H plus and HCO3 minus, which is known as bicarbonate. Now remember that molecule, bicarbonate, is going to come back to bite us in the digestive system and the urinary system as we deal with all sorts of acid-base issues that come up in those systems. Bicarbonate is the basic molecule that your body pretty much universally uses to neutralize acids. Okay. So when CO2 is high, when we have a high level of CO2, that pushes all of these reactions to the right. So we get more carbonic acid and more H plus bicarbonate in our buffer system. Okay. We can think of that as a loading mode akin to the high affinity mode of hemoglobin that shifts everything in our body toward making more bicarbonate buffer and more acid in our blood. And that happens in tissues where CO2 is being actively produced. Now, what about when CO2 is low? When we have a low CO2, which is what happens in the lungs, where CO2 is actively being breathed out of the body, then all of these reactions go the other way, and bicarbonate and H plus combine to make carbonic acid, which splits up to make water and CO2, and the CO2 leaves through the lungs. So up here we have tissues producing CO2, which produces carbonic acid, which produces bicarbonate and acid ions. In the lungs, we have acid ions and bicarbonate combining to form carbonic acid, which immediately splits to form carbon dioxide and water. The water just hangs around, and the carbon dioxide is exhaled in the lungs. Okay, so the story is not quite that simple. There are a couple of other things that happen. The enzyme that makes carbonic acid form and then unform, form in the tissues and then unform in the lungs is called carbonic anhydrase. And it exists in large amounts only in the red blood cells. So your CO2 actually has to travel into a red blood cell, form carbonic acid, split into bicarbonate and H plus ions, and then the bicarbonate, in order to be useful as a blood buffer, has to leave the red blood cells. And to balance the charges, as a negatively charged thing leaves the ion, it leaves the cell, chloride is imported into the cell, and this is called the chloride shift reaction. Okay. A lot of that H plus, to keep from completely acidifying the red blood cells, sticks to deoxyhemoglobin and is carried around in the blood that way. Then all those reactions shift in the lungs. The chloride shift runs backward. The H plus and HCO3 combine again, and then that uncombines to export CO2 from the red blood cell and export that CO2 again into the air of the lungs. Okay. Finally, internal respiration takes place in our tissues, where oxygen, as we noted before, is being carried around in the blood at about 100 millimeters of mercury. CO2 is being carried around in the blood at about 40 millimeters of mercury. And the gas in the tissues tends to be 40 of oxygen, 45 of CO2. So let's see how that works. We have blood that we would identify as red blood, high in oxygen, entering the tissue. Maybe it's lost a few millimeters of mercury of oxygen along the way, so it's now down to about 95. But compare that 95 to a level of 40 in the tissues, and once again we have this idea of blood and tissues setting up a concentration gradient. 95 oxygen in the blood, 40 oxygen in the tissues. The concentration gradient, the direction down the concentration gradient, is from blood to tissues, so naturally that's the direction this big red arrow is going to take. And as oxygen leaves the blood, the oxygen concentration in the blood falls until it equilibrates with that 40 in the tissues, and so we have blue, low oxygen blood leaving the tissue on the other side. The opposite happens with CO2. CO2 enters at 40, but it's being produced in the tissues, so it exists there at 45. Down the concentration gradient would be moving from the tissue to the blood, so that's why we have this big blue arrow pointing from the tissue cells to the blood. CO2 rises in the blood until it meets the tissue, equilibrates with the tissue, and so it leaves at 45. Okay, so this diagram is the best I have for describing all of this, and yet it confuses the heck out of a lot of my students. So I'm going to try to do the best I can with this summary here. So blood entering the alveoli comes in at 40 millimeters of oxygen. There in the alveoli is about 105 millimeters of oxygen. Down the concentration gradient is that way, so the oxygen is going to move from air to blood. And it's going to move until the blood leaving the alveoli catches up with the air, so it's going to leave at 155 oxygen. Now it loses a little bit traveling through the blood, so it enters the tissue maybe at about 95. The fluid in the tissue is about 40. We see our down the concentration gradient here means that oxygen is going to move from blood into the tissue, and so the blood leaving the tissue blood is going to fall until it equilibrates with the tissue, so blood leaving the tissue is going to be 40. And then if we follow that all the way around the circulation system back to the lungs, we should find that that 40 is what's coming back in on the other side. Now at 105, the hemoglobin mode here is near 100% affinity, so we called that our loading mode. Okay, at 40 in the tissue here, we're down to about 75% affinity. So we're in our unloading mode. Okay. Let's do the same for CO2. CO2 enters the lungs. Enters the lungs at 45 millimeters, but the air in the alveoli is only 40. So if we look at our concentration gradient, that's going to have CO2 move from blood to air. And it's going to move until CO2 has dropped to equal the air. So CO2 is going to leave at 40. Follow that through the body to the tissues. CO2 enters the tissue at 40. Fluid in the tissue is about 45. So this time, going down the concentration gradient has CO2 moving from tissue into the blood. Okay, and it's going to do that until the blood fills up with enough CO2 to match the tissue. And so blood is going to leave at 45. And again, if we sort of travel through the circulatory system back to the lungs, 45 is where we enter the into the lungs again. So with CO2 moving out of the blood, okay, into the air, then our bicarbonate mode is going to be the unloading mode, where H plus HCO3 minus are forming carbonic acid, then reforming into H2O and CO2 is leaving in the air. Okay, if we look at the internal situation, the tissue is producing CO2, which is combining with H2O to form H2CO3, which is then splitting into H plus and HCO3 minus. So that's sort of our loading mode, if you will. Okay. So all of these processes are happening pretty much simultaneously throughout your body. Oxygen is working its way into your from your lungs into your tissues. CO2 is making its way from your tissues out to your lungs, and all of these events are happening pretty much woven together at the same time. Okay. My next lecture is going to be on the anatomy of the airways and the lungs, the ventilation system. And then my last lecture will be the physiology of pulmonary ventilation. Thank you for your attention. If you learned something, leave me a like or a comment in the space below, and keep studying.